Okay. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. I have a special place in my heart for Richard III. It is the first Shakespeare I did fully independently and intensively. And it is a wonderful play of contradictions, of simultaneously being supposedly very easy to read and yet also very difficult. The hypocrisies that come through in our current understanding and in what comes out in the text is striking. Also, who doesn't like a good villain? Richard is a much more complex character than I think he is often given credit for. This particular beginning speech, "Now is the winter of our discontent," a line which has been used in countless other iterations in our culture since, I think speaks to that. I'm going to head through this speech and see if any of these insights help anyone. So, now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. So firstly, obviously, there's the juxtaposition between winter and glorious summer. There's also this pun on son. Obviously, the three sons of York were George, Duke of Clarence, Richard, our main hero, or anti-villain, or whatever he is in this play. What is he? I don't know. And Edward IV, who is currently the king. But when we talk about made glorious summer by this son of York, Richard is referring to his brother the king, Edward. There's also an old saying / belief that at the battle where the Yorks won and prevailed, which brought Edward IV to the throne, 3 suns stood in the sky to notify the 3 sons of York: Clarence, Edward IV, and Richard. So made glorious summer by this son of York is a pun on that, and also a well-known expression which would have been known then. Now is the winter of our discontent is a very good example of iambic pentameter. The ba-bum, 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 bum-bum, which you would understand is like a heartbeat, I think quite often people have heard. But the way to feel it is, as you go through, try and find that beat. Now is the winter of our discontent. I always say to the actors who I help that you should find it, you should remember it, and then you should discard it in your performance. The internal beat is very useful for helping you find meaning when you have this kind of now is... wrong way. Okay, and now is the winter of our discontent. I need to get better at doing this pen thing. But it gives this feeling of pace. And if you're trying to find where the emphasis is or what your character's motivations might be, when you find the emphasis of where Shakespeare's asking you to put the emphasis, that helps. It makes you, as a lazy actor, it helps you to understand and it helps you to learn as well. You don't have to make quite so many decisions. And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings. There's a bit of language here, particularly this idea of bruised arms hung up for monuments and stern alarums changed to merry meetings and victorious wreaths. Obviously, Shakespeare was fairly obsessed with the classical era, as were most in the Tudor period. So there's a lot of Roman and Greek ideas. So the idea of a triumph in victorious Rome, the victorious wreaths that you would be given laurel leaves should you come back from a great triumph to Rome. And so our brows are bound with victorious wreaths, us the 3 sons of York who first had this wonderful moment. We have celebrated our bruised arms, are hung up for monuments. They're hung up as a triumph and showing what they'd achieved. And our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. And as we go through this extra bit of the sentence towards the end, you begin to hear Richard's discontent, that we have this reflection of the stern alarums changed to merry meetings. So he's not particularly happy about this, that you're going from war to a peacetime, and we're beginning to get this impression that he is not happy. And as we go further forward, hopefully we will find out why. Another point is, you hear me say bruised. That is again because I found the pronunciation in the meter. If you ever have trouble, once you find the ba-bum, 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 it helps you discover where the emphasis might be. And yes, so our bruised arms hung up for monuments works, whereas our bruised arms hung up for monuments. It just doesn't sing in the same way. You could make that a decision. That could be a choice, but that is, I find it easier to let my understanding of the meter inform what I'm going to do rather than fight it. So down we go. Our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. So, we're now having a personification of war, grim-visaged war. From what we hear above about the glorious son of York, up here, and then and all the clouds of the house, a lot of this feels like a personification of his elder brother, of Edward IV, who Richard is clearly pissed off with, to put it mildly. Grim-visaged war, I think, take that to mean Edward IV in this. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. I don't think Richard is particularly happy. Let's put it that way. We also have this great moment which changes from the ba-boom, ba-boom of the meter. Again, I'm going to say meter a lot. I apologise. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now instead of mounting barbed steeds, it's very almost like the drum beat which you would need to keep in sync when marching. So again, this feeling of war. We go into, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. Richard is slightly, well, more than slightly annoyed that his elder brother has left him and has forgotten war, no longer wants war, and instead is thoroughly enjoying a woman's company, which Richard disapproves of. Lascivious, I always like that word. And then we get to the heart of the matter. But I that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking class, I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, stent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up. It's a cry of someone who is in a lot of pain. I think it's interesting that no matter how villainous we see him portrayed in most adaptations of Richard, you always root for him in an odd way. But what I'm intrigued by, and again, I have a real interest in the historical versus the propaganda that's going on in Shakespeare and what Shakespeare's trying to do with this play, that it's known that Richard was in battle, and he's in battle at the very end, and he's in battle before this. You know, the grim-visaged war, he was clearly with his brother higher up here. But he's not shaped for sportive tricks. I think there's a distinction being made between war and this kind of really fighting for your legacy, fighting for your life, and the kind of thing for sport. I am not shaped for sportive tricks. Like, this is clearly referencing Richard's supposed cripplehood, and in this play he is absolutely described and is characterised as a cripple, which is a hypocrisy again of the of this idea of someone who could very easily go to war but isn't shaped for the niceties of court, of sport in jest, say. I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. I just think it's the disillusionment is just crying off the page during this bit. That I am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up. This is where we get the motivation for the rest of the play, where we watch Richard destroy his family, destroy the kingdom. Why? He's telling us that he cannot live in a world without pain and without war, and that in which case he will tear everything down because he cannot partake in something of sportive tricks. And that's so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. So interesting, but dogs bark at me, dogs barking at a stranger, dogs barking at an outsider, as I halt by them. Haltingly is, the limp, this idea of someone who's not moving fast, not moving easily, which again is this interesting hypocrisy of that he clearly is very good in war, but is not moving well in this new society, in this new world he finds himself in. Why I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. Anyone seen Peaky Blinders? Because partly what this is reminding me of is that moment when Tommy is told to have a break and it almost destroys him because he is constantly running, and the minute that he has nothing to do, he is consumed by everything that he has done in the past. He can't stop, and that's partly, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time. So he's nothing, all he's left with is thoughts and regrets and no purpose right now. Again, this cry for something to do, for a world where he once more has a place is coming out. Why I in this weak piping. Okay, the other point here is piping, that boy, and where is it? Descant. So we've got an idea of music here, again, going back to the lascivious pleasing of the lute up here. Lascivious pleasing of the lute. A lute, obviously, is a stringed instrument, but piping ties into descant. A descant is means high in general in classical music. So in recorder level, wait, let's see if I can... So descant is this size. Or, can we see that? Descant is this size of recorder, which is your classic Commonwealth Garden primary school kid who wants to make the most horrific noise ever. It's reasonably cheap to produce, but it is that size, which creates that kind of sound. Whereas treble's that size. So by comparison, and treble's a constant instrument. So descant means higher. It has a slightly more fluting tone. It also, in choral singing, which brings into pipes, is the higher line, which is a harmony often. If you're interested, quite a lot of Christmas carols have descants, Hark the Herald in the final verse, or Come All Ye Faithful. Descant. So here, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. So he's slightly kind of pulling this this joke, but it's not a joke, and it's actually quite painful. This idea of laughing at himself and laughing at the thing which hurts him most. Is that what I'm expected to do? Am I expected just to laugh and be this little boy who can just pipe and play the lascivious lute and nimbly dance away and descant on how pathetic I am? It's a real cry of pain. And so we've heard what the cause is, the cause of his hatred of this time, this cause of pain and this cause of hurt. And now we hear what he's going to do, and this sets the scene for the rest of the play, remembering this prologue is the very first speech of the play. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. So now we hear what's going to happen. That we're also setting up this element of Richard being the storyteller, the one who jokes and comes to the audience. What's quite interesting about this is that it's, in Shakespeare, it is the tragedy of Richard III. It's not a history in his title pages. And generally what happens in Shakespeare is that you do often have the character who speaks to the audience. It's very rarely also the main character. In Othello, Othello is the noble figure, and Iago is the simpering person who comes and speaks and says what he's going to do and how awful it's going to be. Whereas here we have the main character, Hamlet equally. I'm not sure Hamlet ever does speak to the audience, say. It's always very much a soliloquizing of what he's thinking, but he's not recognising the fact the audience is there in the way that this is. The kind of the nudge, nudge, wink, wink of, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, he's telling us what's going to happen, and he's going to be our bridge in the kind of Greek theatre idea. He is the chorus. He is the one who is relating to us what the narrative is happening and what he's going to do and how it's going to influence the other people who are not aware of our presence. So that's being set up here as well, that kind of relationship. This is also, if anyone enjoys House of Cards, a lot of this is based, this Machiavellian character is based on Richard III and on this way of speaking in these things. So, plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. Yeah, so history, again, in terms of historical accuracy, I think Clarence has got one of the best deaths, probably barring Edward II in monarchical English history. Clarence is drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, which is apparently the death he chose, but it's still a good one, I'd say. History in general makes us think that Clarence was a bit of a fool and power-hungry. In this play, he is played as noble, a bit ignorant, and dies because of Richard's Machiavellian schemes. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up. So again, what I'm always interested in this play is that Richard is such an interesting character of many different layers and different motivations and attitudes. And it always feels like there's just been this veneer of Tudor propaganda which just went straight on top of the play. It's like Shakespeare finished it and gave us all of this stuff and then suddenly went, oh wait, he needs to be completely hated as well. I need to make sure he's pantomime. Cool, okay, just do this. So we've had this entire speech where we hear him kind of crying out for help and for deformed, unfinished sense into this world, scarce half made up, where is that? Deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up. This cry of someone who's really in pain. And then we get all the way down to, as I am subtle, false and treacherous down at the end, which is just like a throwaway, just like, you might be sympathising, but do remember that he also is, is the enemy of the current Queen and King. He has to be the villain of this. You do remember that, right? Cool. Okay, cool. Let's continue. Talk about interesting self-censorship here. So this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be. Dive thoughts down to my soul. Here Clarence comes. So this great moment of a prophecy which says that G of Edwards, again, there's a lot in this play around prophecy, and above all, read that as Shakespeare covering his ass surrounding doing a play about the king who was defeated by Henry Tudor, the grandfather of Elizabeth I. So there's a lot about the predetermination within this plot, a lot of Margaret who comes and says, I told you he's a bad un. Oh, we don't believe you. Oh, Margaret, we should have listened to you. Yeah, which I find quite personally tedious. But again, prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs, the murderer shall be. So cleverly it's saying that, oh, well, he thought George, Duke of Clarence, whereas actually the murderer of Edward's heirs, the Princess in the Tower, is actually Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Gloucester or George. Fun. Dive thoughts down to my soul. Here Clarence comes. I like this idea of kind of like dive down to my soul, which I think is speaking to I'm a villain, so therefore my soul is much more towards the hell rather than the heavenly here. I'd really recommend reading more of this particular play. It's a wonderful example of hypocrisy, and yet also there's some real jewelled moments within here. Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with the victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I, that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty, to strut before a wanton, ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain, and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. And if King Edward be as true and just as I am subtle, false, and treacherous, this day should Clarence closely be mewed up about a prophecy which says that G of Edward's heirs the murderer shall be. Dive thoughts down to my soul. Here Clarence comes.